Woo! Here
Woo.
we go. There's my.
Good morning. Good morning
Good,
once again, Timothy.
good
That was a
morning,
nice
Maya.
dance. I feel sorry for the people who couldn't see it, but maybe next time, who knows?
Well, we lose our audience every week, so just another little bit of encouragement there.
Right. So it's Sunday morning, June the 11th, and quite a few legislations. I think that they have been passed already this week and maybe the week before. We also have some questions to talk about from last week. And I hope that we can actually give a few numbers there as well. So, without any further ado, I want to give you the floor because,
Okay,
yeah, okay, that's okay. Let's go
let's get right into it. Thank you very
right into
much.
it. Yes,
Thanks, Maya, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. Today is June 11th, 2023, and this is episode 122, Maya.
yes, it is. Congratulations.
Thank you. We
And
come to you every week bringing you issues and items of importance that's going on in Japanese politics that have an effect in the near term or actually right now. So we talk about those issues. We talk a lot about the prime minister. We talk about potential for elections because that's somewhat disruptive, and also what the economy is doing and how that impacts Japanese politics. So um, I very much appreciate you staying tuned and being interested in Japanese politics. There's a lot going on there, and every week we give you an update. So without wasting any more time, let me give you some of the highlights. So we are in the 155th diet session. That means every year there's another diet session. When they hold an official one, it gets a new number. We are in 155. It's supposed to end on June 21st. That's in just 10 days. They've got lots of bills that they haven't passed yet because of, I don't know, lots of things. The Constitution says that the diet must be in session from January for a 120-day period. So we are in that period now. Other diet sessions can come up, an extraordinary session or a special session, depending on what the prime minister, what the cabinet decides. But we are in the end. We are at the end of this diet session. There'll be probably a diet session before the year ends out to wrap it up, and then to move into the new diet session which would start in January. The government has just announced that it is going to extend this session past the 21st, probably for about 10 days. And that's important because it tells you that they haven't been that successful in passing the bills because of whatever. I think that one of those whatevers is G7, which took up a lot of space, a lot of energy in the legislative process. We had a couple of minor hiccups, minor scandals, not really big stuff. The prime minister pretty much got beaten up with people attacking him through his son, Shotaro, who he eventually fired last week because of a Christmas party that he held, a family Christmas party that he held inside the prime minister's residence. And so the bills that they wanted to pass, that they've committed to passing, I think when they started this session, Mr. Hagiura, who is in charge of that process, announced that they would pass 60 bills this session. And there's some big ones that are just kind of teetering on being passed, not being passed. There's a lot of go slow with some of the opposition parties. There are protests. If you drive around Nagatacho, or if you're around the Diet Complex, I know some of you are, you will notice that there's a kind of a band of protesters on certain segments of the property there. And it kind of like an accordion, it grows. Maybe after around 5 o'clock, people gather there after work. And then on the Saturdays and Sundays, it gets pretty boisterous. But people are upset about the immigration bill, about LGBT bill, about a lot of things that the Diet is considering now. And you might have noticed on TV the other day, there was a big ruckus in one of the plenary sessions of the upper house where people were kind of jostling, almost swinging fists, something that hardly ever happens. One of the Diet members was chastised as a consequence of his dramatic exposure of his enthusiasm to oppose what was going on. But there's a lot of jostling going on there, and I think the government said, let's take the temperature down a little bit by extending. Maya, can you turn down your mic? Or maybe your cat just walked on it.
Yes.
Thank you. The jostling that's going on is a consequence of the fast pace that the government is pushing. They want to pass these bills, and the opposition party senses this. And it doesn't take much for the opposition to throw darts, pick up rocks, and throw them at the prime minister or the cabinet. And so, any opportunity to do that, they also sense that the prime minister might call a snap election at the end of this session. So I think there's a mixed bag of opinion on that. If you're reading the tea leaves today, it is highly unlikely that there will be a snap election. But then again, you never know. The fact that the Diet was extended by 10 days kind of indicates there might be a snap election at the end of that period. But I think everything else being in consideration, it's a low likelihood. But let me get into some of the bills that we're talking about in the Parliament now. There's an immigration bill that did pass the cabinet. So the cabinet approved it. That means it'll go now as a bill to the lower house, or perhaps the upper house first, for consideration and debate, and then to the upper house, or the other house that hadn't. It has to pass both houses. And there are two immigration bills. This first one, it passed the cabinet. It's been under consideration for a while. You remember the foreign worker program that the Japanese METI and the Justice Ministry implemented about 20 years ago, where unskilled laborers could come to Japan. They could be trained by working in factories and on farms, that sort of thing. A lot of Vietnamese came in, a lot of other Asians came in on that program, and there was a lot of abuses, a lot of criticism against that, and they trashed that earlier last year. And they've come up with a new program, this new immigration bill, that creates two new visas. One visa is for low-skilled blue-collar workers of a certain skill set, and the second category is for blue-collar skilled manual laborers and apprentices of a higher skill level. So they split them up into two categories, and creatively they call them visa number 1 and visa number 2. And they're special visas so that these skilled workers, sometimes unskilled workers, can come into Japan. If you're in category number 1, you can come in for 5 years and work, but you can't come with your family. 5 years is a limitation. You can begin to learn the language, pick up skills there, and then you need to return to your country of origin. The second category is more expansive. It allows you to come in for an unlimited period of time. You can bring your family, and it is relegated to 12 different industries. The first category is relegated to just shipbuilding and construction. And so from all over the world, you can apply for this visa. You can come in for 5 years if you qualify as an unskilled manual labor. So this is probably heavily dependent on male workers. And if you have a higher level of skill, then you can work in these other categories, which is agriculture, aviation, technology manufacturing, food manufacturing, building maintenance, hospitals, fishing, and auto maintenance. So these are just the things that you would, the 3 Ks: dangerous, dirty, and unpleasant working conditions that the Japanese don't want to work at. That is where a lot of these foreign workers in the earlier program were coming into. They need to get this kind of work done. They just don't have the manpower for it. And we reported last week on the continuing declining birth rate of the Japanese, and the pressure that the prime minister is under to create some sort of a impetus, some kind of encouragement for young families or for young couples or to get married and to have children, have 1, 2, 3 children. And that is another discussion that's going on. It's actually almost at a fever pitch. The prime minister has said he will take this issue to unprecedented levels. And so that means a lot of Japanese government money to go to these social services and education and free education. If you have your third kid, what you're going to get as a consequence of that. So that's a separate discussion, but it is all interrelated. They now need to bring in these foreign workers. And this cabinet promoted bill will go into, let me see, it's going into the lower house probably next week. So they want this one to also be passed on an accelerated basis, and it means that it would go into effect in the fall of this year. So that's just a couple of months away. So that tells you the urgency that's going on there. So that immigration bill is now being considered. It's probably not going to create as much controversy, but bringing in foreign workers here always has an impact. There's always something that happens when under Nakasone, a lot of Iranians came in because of a visa deal that he did there. You might remember a couple of years later, there was a lot of Africans that came in, Nigerians and other South African nations that came into the country in kind of a noticeable number because of deals that were cut between Japan and those countries. And this is far larger, it's far more expansive, but it is going to have an impact on society. Society, I think the Japanese government already acknowledges it is contracting, it is shrinking because there aren't enough laborers, and they're scratching their heads and trying to pull rabbits out of the hat so that they can address this. So there's a lot going on there that you'll be able to see the impact of in very short order, within the year, certainly, but if the law is passed by both houses, then it will go into effect in fall. The other issue that's received a lot of attention is the lower house passed the government-sponsored LGBT plus Q plus whatever legislation that has been promised as a consequence of G7. You'll remember that of all of the G7 countries, Japan is the only country that doesn't have legislation dealing with sexual minorities, with discrimination, with different kind of lifestyles addressed by this. So the LDP has been dragging its heels on that. It doesn't want to have an acknowledgement beyond what the nuclear family is. That's the conservative weight of the LDP. It has worked with Komeito and also Ishin and the Democratic People's Party to get this legislation passed through the lower house. So it'll go through the lower house, and they plan to push it through the upper house next week. That means within this session, certainly within maybe the 21st, but since they've extended it, that this will be law by the end of this current diet session 155. It shows you also where some places the coalition of the LDP and Komeito work together with Ishin, with the Democratic People's Party. And this legislation that was passed through the lower house was fought against by the Constitutional Democratic Party, by the Communist Party, and by, let me see who else, it was Reiwa. So the battle lines are there, but in other bills that I'm going to talk about, the coalition changes. So Tuesday you fight against somebody, and Thursday they are your friend because it's a bill that you have promoted, or you have a constituency that benefits from that legislation. So this fight that happened, one of the reasons you saw on TV that it was pushed through so quickly is because the government feels this pressure to run these bills through and get them passed into law. So with this legislation, it is not what the opposition parties wanted. It is what the LDP wanted. They've been talking about it endlessly. They want to create this category of kind of disenfranchised people who belong to this category of LGBTQ, and the LDP and Komeito, also with Ishin, have agreed that it shouldn't be identifying a category of people who have a sexual preference. It should just be more generally people in Japan should be, not people who are apparently discriminated against. So they had an argument about who the law deals with, what's the characterization of those people. And the LDP Komeito position won over in the bill that passed through the lower house. And then the other one is on discrimination against these individuals. So the language that was agreed to is that there can be discrimination, but it needs to be reasonable discrimination. There's been a huge fight on allowing for discrimination as long as it's reasonable. It just kicks the ball down the road, because now you're going to have the argument of what's reasonable, what's unreasonable discrimination. So I think the LDP and the Komeito coalition members kind of came to the decision that they're going to fight on this endlessly. So they're not going to make progress if they try and get everybody's satisfaction. So they rammed it through with just a couple of hours of deliberation. And that when the committee chair says, I'm going to take a vote for that, and you might have seen that in TV, the opposition all gets party. They rush to the speakers. They try and prevent him from calling for a vote. He's surrounded by all of his supporters, and then he calls for the vote. There's a hand vote on this particular issue, and the legislation passed through the lower house. So that's how that happened. That was the excitement with LGBTQ. There's also another bill that's really hot. It is generating a lot of protesters in front of the prime minister's residence. And this is another immigration bill. This one is dealing with refugees. So as you know, Japan accepts so few refugees compared to whatever international standard that you look at. In fact, I think in last year, there were 4,233 applied applications for asylum, and only 202 were approved. Only 202 were approved. I mean, there are thousands in other countries, thousands of refugees that are approved that go through the process every year. Japan, I think, is at the very lowest in accepting refugees. The interesting thing about the number of refugees that they did accept were, of the 202 refugees whose applications were accepted, 147 of those, more than, almost 70% of them were from Afghanistan. So you kind of have to scratch your head and wonder what explains that? Why is Japan accepting Afghani refugees above and beyond everybody else? And they're only accepting 202 this last year. Things are changing. So you'll remember that there was a Sri Lankan girl who died in the detention center in, where was she? I think in Nagoya. She was complaining for a long time, for weeks and weeks, about stomach pains. And they pretty much ignored her. They thought that she was just complaining. And she eventually died in the detention facility. It made a huge issue and generated the kind of force for changing this law. So I think the law as it is right now is not vastly different from what it was before. The government is going to change the refugee status. So currently, if you are seeking asylum here or seeking refugee status, you make an application. You probably are in a detention facility. And when your application is denied or it's pending, you can reapply. And as long as your application is in the process, you can stay in Japan. What they're going to do now is they're going to put a stop date on that. And they're going to say, if you've applied twice, that's the end of it. And you need to go back to the country of origin. And that is creating a lot of problems, because there's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of experience that tells you that although people are seeking asylum for their own economic reasons, there are understandable and justifiable reasons why they are seeking asylum, and Japan should be a little bit more open to that. So it passed. This immigration refugee bill that's causing so much concern was passed in the upper house with the LDP and Komeito tightly holding hands and pushing it through. And of course, the Constitutional Democratic Party is vehemently opposed to it, because it's it's too much like the former law that created all the problems in the first place. The current law provides for more training for the immigration authorities, the detention facilities, and that sort of thing, but it really doesn't address the issue. So it has really upset this, this balance between the opposition party and the government, and so it's made them even more vociferous and more angry about fighting against the prime minister and against the LDP. So as a consequence of that, when you've got people who are angry at you and they can't do anything about it, they don't have the numbers to push it through legislation. They look for other ways to attack you, to diminish you, especially when they think you're going to use it to your advantage to call an election when maybe you're on your back foot and the LDP or the coalition is moving forward on the front foot, and they feel a little bit of wind. You're trying to diminish that. And I think that explains why this attack on the prime minister's son, and the prime minister didn't waste even a day to fire his son, because he understands that snowballing effect. It also, you can see it coming up too in the within the digital agency. The My Number card is also receiving increased scrutiny because of some of the glitches that are there, and I perceive that not only to be a slap at the prime minister, but also maybe some sort of a diminution for Konotaro, because he's on TV almost weekly now, apologizing and bowing for the glitches that the digital agency is allowing to happen under his watch. So it could be, damaging a little bit of his star. His star is rising. If there's a snap election, obviously there's going to be a president race for the LDP in September of next year. So these things are already kind of in play. But in any event, this new immigration bill looks like it will sail through in this diet session. So it's kind of pretty much same-o if you're in the diaspora category. You're trying to seek asylum. You're trying to stay in Japan because you have a articulable need or a fear of discrimination or persecution in your home country. So let's see how that rolls out. You might remember the young kid who filmed himself licking the bottles of sushi or shoyu sauce, and touching the sushi that's going by on the conveyor belt in Sushido. That happened in January. The young kid in his teens filmed himself and then uploaded it on the 29th. This caused a huge storm, and he was eventually sued by Sushido, which is, I think, the largest purveyor of sushi in Japan. The fellow who owns Sushido is the guy who always buys the most expensive. He pays the most for the tuna at the beginning of the new year, so you might remember him. But they've sued this kid and his family for 67 million yen, which is about $480,000. And that was launched on Thursday. So you might have seen something about that. But it's, this idea of becoming famous and filming yourself to get hits and TikTok. I mean, the video itself was 45 seconds. But the impact to not just Sushido, but to the entire rotisserie sushi industry in Japan was immediate and very impactful. So the stock price for Sushido, after the video was released, lost 16 billion yen in one day of market share on the 30th and the 31st. So this was a huge impact, and this kid just thought it was funny and he was goofing around, but he's going to pay for that. He and his family are going to pay for that, and that came down. And I think it's a sign of the times. It's something that is somewhat I don't know. It's unlike the Japan that you might have thought you grew up in. And if you've been in Japan for any long period of time, you're noticing these kind of cracks in the seams already. So it's just one of those things that I hope that the government can address through education and social engineering. But it is a big thing that came open. The other thing that's in the news is that the government promoted a national announcement just this last week, to request saving energy for Japanese households. So this goes out to the entire nation. Please conserve your energy during the months of July and August. Today's June 11th. July is just a couple of weeks away. They put out this announcement because they know that the heat is going to be increased and the amount of power available is going to be decreased. They've already made these calculations. They know it's going to be hot, and they know that they don't have enough energy to provide for air conditioning and for cooling and that sort of thing. So July and August are obviously the hottest months on the Japanese calendar, and they've actually made a specific request to the city of Tokyo, the largest city and the largest city in the world, actually, to reduce consumption of electricity. And that's as a consequence not only of what's going on in Ukraine and the diminution of oil coming into Japan, or the price of oil coming into Japan, but also, if you follow the news, OPEC has also decided to reduce their production by 1 million barrels a day. That's going to push prices up even more. And I think that's one of the issues, but also it's as a consequence of what happened in 2011, the Fukushima disaster. And then as that rolled out, the nuclear power stations were actually mothballed until they did these tests. And the request from the national government to conserve energy and to not use your air conditioners during the summer months. This is the first time since 2015. And 2015 was a very hot year, but it also triggered the Japanese government for promoting, save energy, because of the Fukushima disaster actually kind of tumbling out. It took 2 years to kind of hit the entire population. But the other thing that's coming out of this is that the National Ocean and Aeronautics Administration, NOAA, in Washington, D.C., it's actually a very highly regarded oceanographic and atmospheric administration, announced that El Nino is in effect now. It is building, and the impact of El Nino will be mostly felt in June, July, and August. But it's a pattern. It's a weather pattern that actually continues throughout the year. We have, for the last 4 years, been in an El Nino pattern, which is cooler in our hemisphere here, a cooler pattern of ocean currents and wind and air. But now we're going into the opposite side of the El Nino, and the Philippines, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, other countries are already suffering from that with floods and high temperatures. I think I just saw some news report that London is going to have the hottest summer on record predicted this year, and they don't have enough cooling capacity for that as well. So it's something of a, if not a global phenomenon, at least the northern hemisphere is going to be suffering from that, and Japan is in the path of benefiting or being diminished as a consequence of that as well. So it's pretty serious that it's going to happen. The NOAA administrator said this is going to be, we are in unprecedented territory with this El Nino. So it looks like it's going to be a big one. And I don't know if we are adequately protected from it, especially in light of the fact that the Japanese government put out this announcement, please conserve your energy. You're not going to have enough energy to cool yourself this summer. So that's pretty worrying. The number of my number glitches has increased, as you might have been following the news, seeing Taro Kono on TV pretty regularly this last week, explaining what the glitches were, who was affected, how many people. And so this is a big issue. The my number system, this card that is being issued, 77% of Japanese people have the card. And that means, in fact, the foreigners should get it as well if you are a resident of Japan. And it is the Social Security kind of system that connects all of your banking information, your social insurance information, that sort of thing, into one place. So they're embedding now the payments for social insurance. If you go to the hospital, it's registered there. You get your identification, everything in one spot, not just only your signature verification and the documents that you need for renting a house or that sort of thing. So the My Number system is a big deal for the Prime Minister. He is the president of the Digital Social Promotion Council, as you might know, and it's his push to get Japanese society in on a digital footing. And it is not just the creation of the digital agency, which was achieved by Prime Minister Suga 2.5 years ago. It is also the implementation throughout society of people using digitization and not paper and not hanko and not faxes. And so it's a very big issue. And anytime that there's a glitch, it's really it's a black eye for the prime minister, and it's a black eye for the person who happens to be in the unfortunate position of in the leadership there, and that's Kono Taro currently. So there's still more to be done with that. They're putting a lot of emphasis on fixing that, but it is an issue that I think the Japanese people are watching carefully, and in some instances they kind of criticize the administration, they criticize the government for not doing a better job on it. So that's one of the issues that will continue to come up. Moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit about the current diet situation with regard to a snap election. It looks like that's not going to happen. There are a couple of things that are in this kind of area of consideration. One is the Abe faction is the largest political faction within the LDP. It consists of 100 Diet members. The second, third, and fourth faction within the LDP are Mr. Aso's faction, Mr. Motegi's faction, and Mr. Kishida's faction. But they are, 50% less. So in driving policy, in driving the government, when there is a leader of the Abe faction, the prime minister needs to consult with that person so that they can move policy along, they can fix things that are going forward. And with the Abe faction, kind of, I can't say it's in disarray, but it is being guided by a coalition of four senior faction leaders. And, the reason why they can't figure out who the leader is going to be is because obviously when there is an election for prime minister, the Abe faction will promote their candidate, and that candidate will be whoever is the president of the faction, who is the faction leader. So everybody wants to be that person. They don't want to relinquish it to somebody else who is at some form of parity with them. So it's just a constant crab fight, and they haven't been able to really settle that up yet. The anniversary of the assassination of Mr. Abe approaches. That's in July, I think the first week in July. And there was some speculation that by the time that rolls around, then the faction would come together and announce who their leader would be, and that doesn't look like that's going to happen. And one of the reasons why that doesn't look like that's going to happen is because of the four leaders, Mr. Hagiura was one of the prominent leaders. There are four of them, and Mr. Hagiura is in charge of. He's in the LDP administration, so he is an executive for policy research. So he's helping people figure out what election district they're going to run in if there is an election. He helps figure out and define how much money they're going to get for their campaign. He also helps guide what kind of policies are going to be promoted by the LDP. So it's a really central position, and it is a position of considerable power. And being in that position within the Abe faction is a signal that you are qualified and in the position to take over the leadership. The problem here is that there's a rift now between Komeito and the LDP, and a lot of people are saying it's Mr. Hagiura's problem. And this problem is, if you remember 1010, 1010 is the gerrymandering situation that we are in now. So if there's going to be an election for the lower house, the new gerrymandering will come into play. It hasn't come into play yet. but in this next election it will. And it means that 10 seats in the rural areas that have lost populations will be redistributed to the highly populated centers, the big cities, and Tokyo will get 5 of those. And in one of those new seats, Komeito has said to the LDP, we would like to put our man in that seat, in seat number 28 within Tokyo. And Mr. Hagiura said, yeah, well, that's all well and fine, but I have a guy, my friend, I want to run in that district, that new district. He's likely to win with my backing and from the LDP. He's likely to win. And Komeito said, look, you owe us this one. It's a new seat. We have been in a coalition and we vote for you in those areas where we don't have a candidate because we're a smaller party. We can't put a candidate in every election district. So in those districts that we can't put a candidate, we tell our members, our Komeito members, to vote for you, and they do. They do almost religiously. They follow what we say here in the headquarters. The LDP is not like that. The LDP is made up of factions. They have their own mind. They have their own way of doing things, and they're not bound by a certain philosophy, whereas Komeito is. So the Komeito action with the LDP was, we support you throughout the country in doing that. And all we're saying is, with regard to this particular seat, we want to run our guy. And that was refused by Mr. Hagiura. And so this whole brouhaha happened over the last 2 weeks. And it was a kind of an ultimatum, tit for tat warfare that was going on. It was finally resolved, but Komeito has decided that they will support the LDP in those districts outside of Tokyo, as usual, and the LDP will leave them to run in those areas that they are particularly strong, and they won't run an LDP candidate. It's not the same thing as telling the LDP to vote for the Komeito, but without having an LDP candidate, it's kind of the same thing. But for Komeito, it's a little bit more difficult if they don't have a candidate and they're telling their members, please vote for the LDP candidate. It really depends on, the sensibilities that their members feel with this relationship with Komeito and the LDP. They read the newspaper, they're following what's going on, this fight that's going on with the LDP. They might be less inclined to vote for the LDP. And as we've talked on this briefing before, the difference between the winner and the loser in the vast majority of lower house seats is less than 0.0 some number percent. So in some areas it's 800 votes. And when the Komeito votes for the LDP candidate, they usually bring about 60,000 votes with them in any election category. So the LDP, some of these candidates they really rely on the Komeito vote to help support them and to break that little gap so that they become a member of the parliament. This year, it's going to be a little bit more dicey. And if the Komeito members, maybe 60 votes in each election district, if they feel this sense that the LDP is not playing fair with them, that they should have been, more like a coalition partner rather than, being very flippant with them, they're going to vote for somebody else. And the person they're going to vote for, they're not going to vote for the Communist Party. They're not going to vote for the Constitutional Democratic Party. They're going to vote for probably Ishin, the Ishin candidate. So this kind of dynamic here is very dangerous for the LDP. They've run analysis and they said if they hold the election today with the prime minister's ratings where it is now, the LDP would probably lose about 60 seats, and that would be significant. That would bring them down below the 50% mark, and that means they would have to rely more heavily on the Komeito to bring them to that 51% and beyond. Actually, what they're looking for is the 2/3, and so that goal seems to constantly be escaping them, and particularly with the politics that is going on now, this Hagiura kind of issue with the 28th district and the Komeito feeling a little bit less love from the LDP. It's a dynamic fraught with challenge for the LDP. So the long and the short of this is we've been talking for the last several briefings, maybe 4 or 5 of them, about the possibility of a snap election. A snap election is an election called for by the prime minister. It can happen kind of two different ways. One way is the opposition party is just so angry with the way the administration is running ramshackle over them. They host a no confidence motion, and the House closes down because of a no confidence motion, and they have an election. The more likely scenario is that the prime minister says, I, on my own authority as prime minister, I'm going to close out the House, and we're going to have an election in 5 days or in 6 days. And then election campaigning starts, 10-day campaigning period, and then they have an election. So the possibilities of that, it was being considered, we've been talking about it, that it might happen on the last day of this diet session, which would be around the 21st or the 19th, he would call that. And then the House would close down on the final day of this session. And then there would be a snap election. The prime minister, as we've talked earlier, has decided to extend the diet for another 10 days. So that kicks that ball down the road. It is unlikely that the scenario that we initially considered is going to happen. The Japanese population, they've done polls that said, 78% of the people polled said, we don't want you to call a snap election during this diet session. Get the goddamn bills passed through legislation, pass the bills you said you were going to pass. And then if you want to do that because you're selfish and you want to pack your nest and you want to make sure that you have a stronger position after this diet session, then do it then, but don't do it beforehand. And so that carries a lot of weight. So now the ball is being kicked down the road another 10 days. So still in this month, the diet will close out the last day of this month. It is possible that on the last day, the prime minister calls for a snap election, but it really doesn't look very promising. The prime minister's approval ratings, as you know, leading up to G7 and right after G7, it was in the 53, 55%, and that fell down after about 8 days. So it fell really quickly, very precipitously. The fact that he had to fire his son because these photographs of the family party from January first splashed out into Bunshun just a week ago. And so the prime minister saw that. He didn't want to deal with it, so he fired his son and hired a new secretary to take his place. So there's real delicacy here. My position, my assessment here is that there probably won't be a snap election. The diet will be extended. There will be several bills that will be passed. We'll move into the summer session and take it from there. But I think the first thing that the prime minister will do will be to have a cabinet shuffle. He will rearrange the seats and the individuals there. There are some people that hold positions of importance and power, not only within his cabinet, but also within the LDP. And he wants those people out. He wants new people in. And with a year and a half under his belt, I think he's trying to figure out how he can make his position stronger so that when the LDP presidency comes up for election in September, he's in a better position to take hold of that. But, there are other things that are going on geopolitically, regionally, with the economy. The Japanese economy, compared to 10 years or 20 years ago, is just a fraction of what it was. Their LDP is still scrambling to get, the economy out of the doldrums. The fact that the foreigners are coming in. So this last month, 2 million foreigners visited Japan. It's not 3 million as it was before the pandemic hit. So before the pandemic hit, and you might remember that during that time, there were so many foreigners that were coming in, particularly in Kyoto, that it was generating like a backlash. People were criticized for it. People didn't like it. All this buying of Japanese goods and going to the airport, loaded down with washlets and rice cookers and things like that, was good for the economy, but it was just a little bit too rambunctious. So this last month, 2 million came in. You just can't, it is so obvious if you're walking on the streets and you notice the number of tourists that are in town. It is really uplifting and vibrant for the economy. Japan needs to get back there. So this boost from the foreigners coming in and purchasing things, staying in hotels, visiting, eating out, that sort of thing, it really has boosted the economy. It's kind of a bellwether of other things to happen. But the immigration bill for bringing in more foreign workers that we talked about earlier, visa category number 1, visa category number 2, it is somewhat worrying because the way GDP grows is the number of people that you have, and I think that's one of the reasons why the United States has this issue with the southern border of Mexico. The more people that the economy has, the higher the gross domestic product can become. And when you have a declining population, your GDP is going to go down. It is the connections between the two are inseparable. So I think Japan is pushing for that, bringing in more foreign workers, lower skilled workers, but the economy needs it. And there's so much that's going on in terms of higher skills too, the digitization of society, the building of the chips in Kumamoto, TSMC, the Sunny factory, and the chips that are being that will be built there. That's a 10-year lead time. So there is a lot going on in the Japanese economy. There's a lot to be hopeful for, but this summer doesn't look like it's going to be very, very pleasing with El Nino and with the lack of energy resources. So if the prime minister does call for a snap election, then my analysis is that he knows that something worse is going to be coming down the path in the later months. So he better do it now while his popularity is somewhat level, rather than wait for 2 months where he finally announces how much the Japanese consumer is going to be paying for his unprecedented attention to the declining birth rate, or to how the distribution of the defense spending is going to happen, or how many foreign workers are going to be coming into the country. So there's a lot of barbs that can be thrown at the prime minister coming down the path, especially if he becomes a little bit more demonstrative about how money is going to be collected and how it's going to be spent. So there's a lot to be curious about. We will continue to watch it. I'm going to be reporting to you each week on this. It is, for me, it's very exciting. It's very insightful what's going on, and it is a bellwether of other things that are going on in the Japanese economy. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to having some Q&A with you, and we can take it from here. Maya, where's Maya?
Here I am. Sorry.
Oh God. Did you see the sweat coming down? I was going, oh gosh.
Almost there, yes. Okay, I'm sorry for anyway for worrying you, but yes, thank you very much for the briefing. And yes, are you okay about staying on
Yes.
screen for the questions and answers?
Sure. Sure.
Yes, wonderful. So we can continue with them. I think that last week, you remember well that we had a couple of questions. One of them was about the birth rate per prefecture. And then the other one was about the woods. And well, actually, the cutting 20% of the cedar woods here in Japan. So I don't know whether we can talk about this this week, or maybe we can leave it to the next week, the next session.
Well, actually, I've spent a lot of time on it. Mario really provided some good insight. Mario was with a company that's selling these saws that actually cut down trees, and he had a different view on what was going on with that. And what the government said that triggered this conversation was they're going to reduce 20% of the pollen that is produced every year. So it's not 20% of the sugi, although you could interpret that must be what they mean. I don't think that's what they mean. I think what they mean is somehow reduce the pollen that's produced. One idea is to cut down 20% of the cedars. And what's the other tree that produces pollen? Maya, I keep forgetting that.
Well, I think that's the Japanese cypress.
The cypress, right? The
right?
Cedar and the cypress, right? And the cedar pollinates first, and then like a week later, then the cypress pollinates, and it just infects the entire country. You know, the amount of the pharmaceutical industry that benefits from that is just huge. I think probably more than 50% of the Japanese population is negatively affected by these, what do you call it? Asthma or
hay fever.
Hay fever, right?
Yes.
And also the production for going to work and being productive and being enthusiastic about your life is also impacted when you have a hay fever attack, and it usually lasts for 2 or 3 weeks. I'm lucky I haven't ever had it, but people that get it, they get it every year.
It is every year. Actually, it lasts for longer than that time. It's about 4 to 5 weeks, depending on the year, of course. But it's really tough time for many people. And I don't know what. Maybe you have heard that, but I think that a couple of years ago, I read some statistics that the percentage of population here in Japan affected by hay fever is about or a little bit over, anyway, 70%. So that's a huge percentage indeed. And it looks like people are, yeah, really suffering from it.
So the idea of cutting down
Oh,
20% of the trees, I don't think that's really feasible. And Mario was telling us that they had that promotion, perhaps in Germany, maybe he was talking about it in Japan. And what happened was the loggers went in, they cut down the trees, but they just left the trees there. It did address the issue of pollen production, but it creates, forest coverage and fire hazards and that sort of thing. And the other idea was that they would take the lumber and make boards out of it. But here in this country, there's plenty of lumber. There's plenty of forested, harvestable lumber. It's just that nobody's using it in construction. There's just oversupply and not enough demand. So I think the 20% that they're going to try to address, maybe it's just chemically induced, or I don't know. Culling 20% of the forest is just it boggles the mind to think about that.
it does. We have a comment from Mario in Clubhouse, and he wrote, Chinese investors seem to be back. Yesterday in IDC Odaiba, there were 50, it felt like 50% of the people there were Chinese and or Taiwanese. According to the salesman, they are usually finishing investment apartments. So that's from Mario, and maybe that's one of the ways to use that wood.
I didn't quite catch that. So Mario said that there was some sort of tenjikai, some sort of
Oh
exhibition.
yes, okay. No, there is a very famous furniture producer in Japan, and the name of that company is IDC. They have a huge store in Odaiba.
Right.
And so Mario said that yesterday it felt like 50% of the people in that store were either Chinese or Taiwanese. And according to the salesman, they are usually furnishing investment apartments. So I guess that those guys, they come to Japan, they buy property here, invest into it, refurbish it, and then probably rent it out or sell it. I have no idea how it is, but maybe that's what Mario. Yes, they buy furniture. Yes,
Oh,
that's
okay.
it.
Maybe that's true, but furniture is, it only uses a very small percentage of high quality wood. And how often do people buy furniture? So I don't know if that really satisfies the demand component of getting 20%.
Yes. Okay, we'll see.
It's a
And
tough one.
it is a tough one. Yes, indeed. And yeah, depending on how many investors come from overseas, probably that percentage, the demand will change, of course. We have also a comment from David, a question maybe. David wrote, would the plan to be the replacement of sugi and hinoki trees with other types of trees? The sudden loss of 20% of forested land would set back Japan's carbon neutrality quite a lot if it is not replaced with non-allergic trees.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Sugi and the cypress trees have a lifespan of what, maybe 400 years, Maya?
Well, some sources say it is about 300, others say 800. So maybe we can go for the medium, that is 500,
Okay.
which is still, several human lives, one after the other.
So you can't wait for them to just fall down because they're dying of
No.
old age, and because of the pollen that's being produced, other saplings will not, be created as well, whether you're trying to manage the forest or not. So yeah, it's just a tough issue. The carbon absorption is a big issue, but any trees that are going to have any value, it's going to be, I mean, the trees that are now populating all of the forests in the mountains, they were planted more than 70 years ago. They were planted before the end of the war in anticipation of this huge boom of housing after the Japanese thought that they would win the war and the population boom. But it's just it's really a tight situation. And the other kind of issue is, let's say the 20% reduction is in culling, in cutting the trees that are on the slopes of these mountains. The after effect of that is erosion. So when the trees are cut and the roots begin to rot, immediately, and all of these trees are planted in non-populable mountain areas. So that means the slope of the mountain is too great. It's not going to be used for agriculture. Let's just plant trees there. They thought it was a good idea, and now look what we have now. So you don't want to go from one bad idea to another bad idea. So it's a real conundrum.
It is indeed. I remember that back home in my hometown, there is a park above the town, and basically maybe 88 years ago there were no trees there, and during heavy rains, a lot of mud would just go down, to the town and so on. So they made it a point actually to to plant trees there, and since then the town has been very safe. So I can see how this can happen if they really decrease the number of trees, the percentage of forest area here in Japan. So yeah, it's really a tough question to solve. Yes. Okay, so the next one from Torrance, we have okay, thank you for the briefing. And are the guidelines for the new visas available for viewing? I will be moving to Japan in September as an exchange student. I will have my degree next year and wish to remain in Japan, but my degree is not highly skilled. So probably, yes, I think that, exchange students like Torrance will probably need to find ways. I mean, like they need to know the ins and outs of the visa legislation here. So are those details out now? The guidelines?
Not really. There will be policy imperatives that will be in the law. And usually what happens in any parliamentary process is they pass the law and then it goes into effect a year later. And the reason for that is because they pass the law and then the various ministries need to design the regulations and the guidelines and how it will be applied. And then it goes into effect, and then those guidelines kick in after the whatever the bureaucracy is that's formed the guidelines and how it's going to be handled. So there might be some dry runs, there might be some experiments that go on for that process. But I think for is it Torrance?
Torrance, yes.
Yes. So for Torrance, I think there's already a visa category that he would qualify for. You're coming in, you're going to be, university educated. So you're not going to fit into the categories where these are blue collar workers that are laborers that they need in construction or in manufacturing or in agriculture, that kind of thing. More likely you are training for some sort of a white collar career. You're going to be here on an exchange program. You're going to learn some Japanese. Many of these people who qualify for visa number 1 or visa number 2, they don't speak Japanese, and probably language ability is not a qualification. So I think there's probably already a visa category available to you. I don't know. If somebody in your category, I don't know much of the details, Torrance, but I think it's not too difficult for you to pick up a job, get a sponsor here for your visa as a humanities visa, that sort of thing. It's done all the time.
Yes, it is, and moreover, actually, so the rate of jobs available for people in Tokyo, especially, to the number of people who are looking for jobs is above 1.7.
Yeah.
So I think that yes, with a university degree, there shouldn't be a problem for you to find a job here and extend your visa. Of course, the guidelines, you need to know the guidelines and so on, but it shouldn't be this difficult with the tight labor market at the moment in Japan. Yes. And David wrote also, all degrees are highly skilled. that non-skilled labor and partially skilled labor refers to people without degrees, but instead with only experience or trade school diplomas. Yes,
Yep.
indeed. Thank you for the comments, David. Yes, and so Timothy, if you allow me to go back a little bit to actual politics, I know, sorry, but there are some news. There is some news actually that the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, he has said that CDP, his party, may actually submit a non-confidence vote.
Yep.
So, do you think that will happen, or it's just a threat to the government of Prime Minister Kishida?
So it is a threat for the Constitutional Democratic Party. They are not large enough to carry a no confidence motion. They can submit it, but it doesn't force the prime minister's hand. Reiwa potentially could. So if there was a coalition of forces between the Constitutional Democratic Party and some other opposition party, they could probably push through a no confidence motion and force the prime minister's hand. I don't think it'll happen. Earlier this week, there was a censure motion against I think it was the Minister of Justice, because of the way that the immigration bill was handled and rushed through the lower house so that it could get a vote and go to the lower house so that it'll be passed this next week. And the LDP and Komeito just pushed it through. They really muscled that. It was reported on TV, very controversial, really strong arm tactic. And so that generated a censure motion that did not pass either. So I think it would require the LDP to be a little bit more criticized, to do something bad, for some sort of a scandal to arise. People are always looking for that. Bunshun is always kind of digging up those issues, even if they're somewhat unsubstantiated. They want to smell it out and see if they can report on it to not only increase sales, but also to leverage some access within the ruling party or within the opposition party. They play both sides. So it's a very, very delicate time now. I don't think the prime minister will call the House. I don't think the opposition will call for a no confidence vote. But right now, as it stands, today is the 11th. There's maybe 20 days left in this diet session, so a lot can happen.
Oh, well, thank you. And if you allow me to just continue a little bit with the CDP and also Ishin, that there is some dynamic there as well. Because once again, I think it was in GG Press or somewhere, that the lawmaker Matsubara Jin, who is, well, a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party, he has said that he will leave the party and run independently in the next general election. And then at the same time, so Ishin Nokai has said that they may welcome him. Yes, come to us. So what is that there? What's that dynamic there? What's happening? Because we know you talked about this in previous sessions, that Ishin wants to be the second, basically the strongest opposition party as it stands. But so what's the dynamic there?
So Ishin doesn't want to become the second. They want to become the primary opposition party. So they have a strategy. They have explained the strategy. It's run, skip, hop. They've finished the run. They are now in the skip portion. So the run was to gather enough votes in Osaka, capture the city and the prefectural seats, and get the governorship of Osaka. They did that this last municipal election. They got the governor of Osaka, and they got the governorship of the contiguous prefecture as well. So they did really well in this last municipal election. And the party chair, Ishin's chairman, Mr. Bamba, has said that this process is probably going to take another 10 years. So it could be, you might think, that the LDP will see the Ishin party as the better party than Komeito, because they have more vibrancy. They have more members than Komeito, even though Komeito has had this relationship with Jiminto for more than 20 years. And as I said earlier, the Komeito provides votes for some LDP candidates that certifies that they get their election. And if they dump them, they need to have something to fill in. And if Komeito doesn't have enough candidates to fill the seats, maybe Ishin does. So these LDP candidates will obviously lose their seats. And if the LDP loses seats in the next election, then the prime minister has to take blame for that, even though there are other contributing factors, and more likely than not fall on the sword, call for election, and or maybe even the LDP says we want a new president, we need a new leader, we need a new prime minister. So that could also happen. But with Ishin and the Constitutional Democratic Party, so the Constitutional Democratic Party is suffering from some maladies. One is in their leadership. Mr. Izumi has not been a really forceful leader, and it's caused rifts inside the party. And there have been people that have been bad-mouthing him publicly, and he's actually had to say, in the press, I want you to stop that. We need to be strong here. We need to have a unified position, and you're blabbering about, how much you dislike my leadership style. It really hurts us. So shut up. So there's a little bit of that going on. So yeah, Ishin looks a little bit attractive. And of course, there's always, bells and whistles and these little candy sweeteners that go with something like that. So having somebody defect from the Constitutional Democratic Party and going anywhere else, but particularly to Ishin at this point in time is, it's pretty significant. And as you know, the LDP factions, the numbers are pretty well set. It's rare for them to increase or decrease by one or two numbers. And whenever there is, we talk about it. We talk about the implications of those defections or those additions. More frequently than not in the LDP, they're not so much defections. They're not people who have left one faction to join another faction. There are people who are independents who haven't decided what faction, and then they join in. There are a lot of independents who were party members, faction members, who just didn't like it. They didn't like, the amount of levity that they were given. They didn't like the fact that they weren't given either a minister or vice minister or a committee portfolio. They're pissed off about that. So they sit there, they bide their time, and then maybe they become independent. So in fact, the independents are larger than what the political parties are. So in some instances, the independents can really sway the vote. So the LDP is bent on continuing that. So that's why they sometimes hold their nose and they stick with Komeito. They relinquish some authority to Komeito. They follow some of the requests of Komeito, but not all of them. And that also causes a little bit of love loss. But for the Constitutional Democratic Party and Ishin, it's not like there's going to be a blending there. It's more like there will be a raiding party that's going on. And that's why many analysts are advising the prime minister, hold your election, the snap election, sooner, because the longer you wait, the more time Ishin has to generate candidates for this eventual lower house election. So do it quickly. They're kicking the ball down the road, only 10 days, but that's pretty big. And I think it also indicates that they're not going to have a snap election. So that means Ishin will be even stronger when he eventually comes around to call for a snap election, if he does. He doesn't need to. There doesn't need to be an election until September of 2024. That's when the election for the prime minister occurs. But there is likely to be a shuffling of the cabinet. That's really precipitous.
Well, thank you for the analysis. And also, so you mentioned that, well, within the LDP, for example, the independents, and also within the Diet, the independents can sway a vote on different issues. But we also know that, so for example, there is, I think it's Tanigaki Group, Yurinkai in the LDP, so that they have mentioned that they may actually change their status from a group to a faction.
Yeah.
So, and then can you tell us your thoughts on this as well?
Okay, there are several groups within the parliament. Mr. Suga has his group.
Yeah.
And depending on how you qualify it, his group could be 20, 30, 50, 60 people. So joining a group, you can be a faction member for somebody else and still belong to his group. It's not a violation. You're going to dinners, you're participating in skull sessions. It's not a faction. And with regard to Mr. Suga, he never had a faction. He's the only prime minister in history that has become prime minister without the benefit of a faction. So I think for him, he's going to lean on that kind of signature move that he has. I don't like the factions. I'm not from the factions. So vote for me. I will coalesce Japanese politics without the factions. The factions are not good for Japanese politics. We're going to move forward with that. So that, I think, is his stance. But for the others to go from a group into a faction, number one, you have to have a pretty strong leader to do that, because factional politics is all about personalities. It's not about positions or your religious or your economic acumen. It is about, you know, your personality, and also how much money you have to help other people get their election. So, for example, in Mr. Hagiura's case, he belongs to the Abe faction, but he occupies a position of great power and authority for people who want to become members of the parliament, or who are members of the parliament, and they want to succeed themselves in the next election. And they need, you know, please make sure that I have a good nest egg so that I can have more posters, that I can have more staff to run the elections for me. And a lot of that is decided by Mr. Hagiura. So a person of his position could possibly, with all of that pent up goodwill that he's generated by divvying out these benefits, he could maybe start a faction. I'm not saying that's even likely, because he's in the Abe faction, but it requires somebody like that, like Shin Kanemaru, who has lots of money. Shin Kanemaru, when he was at his height, was the wealthiest of all Japanese politicians. He could have, and he did in fact have his own faction. But going from a group to a faction, you have to have the wherewithal to get these people to commit to you, and also to have a certain number, 20 people, to vie for you to be a political faction and get recognized. Once you become a faction, then there are lots of benefits. There are lots of, you have a seat at the table. You get to share in the pie that is being divided up during elections. You get committee assignments and that sort of thing. So it is a pretty big deal. Right now, there are about 5, maybe 6 political factions that are recognized. You know, I think the smallest one right now it's not the Nikkei faction. It is, whose faction is it? I've got the notes here, but it's diminished considerably over the last couple of years. It could evaporate, maybe at the death of the supreme leader, or maybe with the transition to his number 2 or to his son. But that's the way things usually happen here. But establishing another faction is a pretty big deal, would be very noteworthy.
Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts. And it's interesting to observe what happens really. So I guess that we can talk about this in maybe a month or 2 again. So if there are some developments, then we can talk about them. And it looks like,
listen,
yes.
I'm happy to get into how you would form a faction if there's enough interest in it. It's kind of getting into the weeds, but maybe people are really interested in that, and maybe we can cut out 5 or 10 minutes in one of the later briefings to talk about the factions, the faction dynamics, how to get to form a faction, and what's the distinction between a group and the faction.
Right. Okay, we can do that definitely. So 5 to 10 minutes is not a problem at all. And one thing that we haven't talked about yet since last week, it was the birth rate by prefecture. So because the LDP actually voted the new, well, they created the new policy, obviously, for the childcare and so on. And we know that some prefectures, let's say Tokyo and Miyagi, are the 2 prefectures with the lowest birth rate, which is like 1.04 and 1.09.
Yeah.
Yes, per woman. And then of course Okinawa, which is also considered to be the the poorest of all prefectures here in Japan, it has the highest birth rate. So is there anything in those policies that says that the budget will be actually allocated depending on the birth rate per prefecture, or they have just decided on the total amount of money that's going to be spent on this, and then not really talked about details and more concrete policies?
Okay, so the prime minister has made pronouncements about that. It is not in the law. It is not quite in the budget yet. But what he has said in public pronouncements is an unprecedented amount of attention will be devoted to this. So what that phrase means, we don't quite know. But over the last couple of weeks, there have been meetings where he's actually addressed this issue to talk about if you have one child, if you have two children, if you have three children, how much money you're going to get, and also the education that the child can expect to receive from the government. The government will subsidize that. And also healthcare, prenatal, also in vitro fertilization. So I think even now, in vitro fertilization is basically free. I'm not sure if it's completely free, but if you're trying to get pregnant and you can't get pregnant because whatever reason, and you have in vitro fertilization, you take the egg and the sperm and you insert them medically. I think the government is on board with that, and apparently the Japanese medical industry is very successful at that. So I think that's part of the component too. But yeah, they're trying to attack the reasons why people are reluctant to have children. That's a huge social issue, and it goes together with how much money they earn as a joint couple or as a single household earner, what their prospects are for the future, buying a house, for example, having security in your employment, having a higher level of economic wealth developed, for example, participating in the stock market, or they even have a category of investment that is protected from taxes that anybody can participate in. So building your nest egg for the future there, they have programs like that. So I think it's a very broad approach, but it hasn't reached any legislation as yet. It's just in the discussion phases. And the critical issue for the prime minister, it's come up in every discussion that he's had. So who's going to pay for it? How is it going to be paid? Oh, that's good, but we just don't have enough time. Let's go to page 3. In page 3, we're going to talk about something else. So he has said that he's going to be devoting, 3.5 trillion yen over the next 3 years. So that's somewhat concrete. And how that's going to be distributed and where that's going to be coming from is not quite yet finalized. So there's a little bit more hammering that needs to go out.
Yes, and to me it looks like well, obviously they haven't talked about this, but there is some overlap between this legislation and then the efforts to keep young people, young families in the countryside or the local regions, because some of those regions are really, they have a very low birth rate, and nobody's actually talking about supporting the economy there, right? So we have seen this huge movement from local areas to the cities and so on.
Yeah.
So maybe LDP hasn't gotten to that point yet.
No, the other interesting thing is that there's the national government that's run by Mr. Kishida, but there's also Tokyo, which is run by Koike's Governor Koike,
Yes.
and it really the prefecture itself, it's a prefecture, and it's also a city government. But this city also has its own policies, sometimes a little bit more advanced, a little bit more progressive than what the national government is doing. And the Koike administration is also pursuing that. If you have children, if you want to move out of Tokyo and have children and maybe set up a company, you will get a certain amount of money from the Tokyo metropolitan government. So they're kind of pursuing that too. It's somewhat counterintuitive because you would think Tokyo wants to increase their birth rate, but they're actually encouraging people to go out to the countryside that's not in Tokyo. So somebody else is going to be benefiting from that. But I think It's enriching the area around Tokyo, the other prefectures, but also opening up Tokyo for maybe a more livable space, and to reduce the number of children that are here because of the maybe the schooling system or the services that are required for that. I'm not quite sure, but there is a lot of action going on there. There's a lot of thought going into it. Somehow, it's for most people, it's distasteful to invite the foreigners to come in to supply that need. They don't want it permanently. They would like it temporarily. The foreigners come in, they do the work, and then they go back to their home country. It doesn't always happen that way, as you and I attest to. We've been here for the vast majority of our careers. Most people in the briefing audience are similar. So they tried with the women, let women shine, and let's rely on the women, the Japanese women, to keep the industry going. That didn't quite work.
Mhm.
So if they have a lot of babies, it's kind of like growing trees. They're not going to be really productive members of society for at least 20 years after their birth. So they're really between a rock and a hard place.
Yes, indeed. Well, and if you probably we can move a little bit back again to well, let's say the elections, because there is a question from Hiroaki on YouTube this time. So he asked, just a moment, the questions are going, yes. Okay, so what kind of election agenda must be highlighted for the coming general election, so that for the lower house members? Because obviously there must be something, like economic growth agenda or something like that, so that all the parties can run, and then they can get the candidates there, they can get elected. What are the interests, so that for the voters? This is the question. But I guess, how can they get voters, through those policies, and what the policies should be?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hiroaki, and thank you always for participating and always, lobbying in great questions. So the issue here is this puff of wind that the prime minister is waiting for. He thought he had it at G7. It's a puff of wind. Vote for me because I am internationally renowned as a leader. And everybody came to Hiroshima, and everybody acknowledged, a peace constitution and non-nuclear. And so vote for me. I'm the prime minister, but vote for the LDP when we have an election. So the dynamic here is that, yes, the other parties need to have a hook that they can hoist their flag on, that says, look at us, we're providing for you. And they're appealing to a certain segment of the population that has that need or has that aspiration. So for maybe Komeito, they're pushing hard on child welfare, on increasing the number of births. In fact, the LDP has kind of robbed the Komeito position because it's a good position. A lot of voters aspire to that. So Komeito is looking for something that's truly theirs, more money per household. So they've had that fight with the LDP, and they've won that frequently, where the LDP has said, let's give gomayen per household. And the Komeito came in and they said, that's just not enough. How about, gomayen per individual, or per individual that's under 20 years old or 18 years old. And so the LDP somewhat acquiesces to that because they want to preserve the coalition, but also the Komeito in this particular instance can tell people, see what we did for you. So if there's going to be an election, make sure that you remember what we did for you. The other parties similarly are trying to pick those issues. And so when the immigration bill is being contested or being debated in the Diet, and you've got all these protesters that are outside the prime minister's residence, that agitation is being supported and fostered by the opposition party. The prime minister is going to do this. Let's not take it. Let's build a coalition and criticize him for doing that. And then when it comes time for the election, they say, we supported you. We didn't want the prime minister to let deportees or refugees to languish in the cells, and we wanted to give them an opportunity to start their new lives. And the prime minister, he said, it's 2 applications, and then you kicked out of the country, and you have to go back to your home origin. And we're supporting that. So it really is a fight between, policies and constituencies. So the communists are like that too. The Communist Party is the smallest of all parties, but it's a very strong constituency. Almost all the educators in Japan belong to the Communist Party. Maybe that's overstating it too much, but the Communist Party is the most intellectual political party in Japan. It is, it produces a flagship newspaper almost on a daily basis, and receives a lot of funding from that. But it is a small political party, but it's very stable, and it tells the people, these are the issues that we stand for. So although they don't increase that much in political power, the people who believe in their ethos and in the policies that they promote stay pretty standard. But there are others, like, for example, Ishin. Ishin is always looking for, what's the hot issue of today? Which issue are we going to stand behind? Can we stand behind it? Do we have enough resources to kind of, promote position papers on that and assert some sort of policy imperative that's different, substantially different from what maybe other opposition parties, or certainly the LDP is talking about. So the LDP, it's the largest. They've got the LDP building. A lot of people are thinking about LDP policies. When there's a good idea that comes up, they put a bunch of smart people on it. The prime minister does his research on it too, and they try to absorb that because they don't want any of the opposition parties or even the coalition partner to have a hook in that is bigger than what the LDP has. So it's a constant battle. It's always going on. And that's why these little fights and sometimes these scandals that come up, for example, the digital agency, and the idea to digitize all of society. There are some winners and some losers in that, and how you feel about that, how your industry is impacted on that, may determine which political party you vote for. And the people who work in your industry, the people that are associated with your product or your services might likewise also vote. So defense spending, we don't want Japan to be a military power, even though you, the LDP, God damn it, you're stepping on our peace constitution and you're increasing. We don't like that, and so we're going to vote for somebody else. So that's the shakeout. But I think you already understand that, Hiroaki. But it's great to follow this briefing every week, because indicators of how that is kind of moving forward every week, it happens. So if you stay plugged in, you'll see that process is continuing.
Well, thank you for the comments, Timothy. Yes, great. So it looks like we have finished the questions and the comments at the moment. And then we can move to actually sharing this. What's this? Yes. Yes. Well, to everybody, you have already heard here in the, of course, in Clubhouse, also on YouTube. We have already shared with you that we're going to have this event on June the 30th, Friday, where Timothy Langley is going to lead the tour of the National Diet Building. It is an exclusive tour, and it's going to be in English, of course. So if you want to listen to his guidance and follow him within, on the premises of the National Diet Building, so join us there at 3:50 in the afternoon. And also that tour is going to be followed by a networking dinner in Hibiya Park. So there is a nice restaurant there. We have booked the place already. And you can save your spot by using this. This is the QR code, which is on screen. Or you can also find the link in Clubhouse. So that's the chat, the room chat, or on LinkedIn, also on Twitter and Facebook. Well, we'll be very, very happy to see you there. Oh, and we'll be happy to spend the evening together. Yes, Timothy, sorry for keeping you silent. Go ahead and tell us.
Thank you very much. So I'm really glad to provide this component of the event, Maya. And I just, I know a lot of people on the briefing, and a lot of people who are in international business and even in politics. They really haven't had the opportunity to physically go into the National Diet. And it's somewhat rare to actually do that. But if you consider, going back to your home country and people say, oh, you came from Japan. Did you climb Mount Fuji? Oh, okay. Did you eat natto? Oh, okay. Did you ever go visit the national parliament? If you're not able to say those yes to those three things, it's kind of like, okay, so what did you do when you were in Japan? So it's a good opportunity. And I think it's a dynamic, especially if you're on this briefing. It is a building you should see to see actually how law is made, how policy is kind of chewed up, and how votes are kind of cast, and what the emperor's role in. You get all of this in a 1 hour tour of the Diet. And like Maya said, we'll gather at 3:50. It gives us 10 minutes to kind of collect. I'm supposed to provide the name of all of the attendees before we go in. They all need to be somewhat vetted. And then we have our tour of the Diet. So I've received permission to do that. But we can only bring in 50 people. So please sign up quickly for that, because it's beginning to fill up. But I'm looking forward to it. And I think it's something that everybody will really enjoy. And then also we have the opportunity to actually meet each other in person and socialize. And I think the venue that Maya has identified is just really enticing. So thanks for putting that all together, Maya.
No, Timothy, thank you for the vote of confidence. I appreciate that. And well, I'm very much looking forward to that, actually, because I visited the Diet once, but there is a lot of things that I want to once again, have the opportunity to see and hear about, and so on.
In less than 3 weeks, right? It's on the 30th, is it?
Weeks.
Yeah.
Yes, that is. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. I know that you have a lot of things to do today, as does everybody else here. And we're looking forward to having you with us next Sunday, of course, once again at 8:20, either here in Clubhouse or YouTube or LinkedIn. Facebook is also live streamed there. But also we have another podcast on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, when we're going to have a special guest again, Sasha Lee Seals. So if you're worried or if you wonder how actually foreigners give up to their communities in Japan, I invite you to join us on Wednesday at 8 o'clock, because there is something very special there. And I'm sure that we can all learn something from Sasha. But
absolutely.
That's all for today. So, Timothy, once again, thank you very much indeed. This was Japan Expert Insights, Japanese Politics One-on-One with Timothy Langley, and me as a host, Maya Matsuoka. One last thing, if you find these sessions informative, please share them with your colleagues and friends, and let them know so that they can benefit from them as well. Thanks. That's all for today.
See you next week.
See you next week. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya. Thanks, everybody.